Well, welcome back. I certainly hope that you are well. Let me begin today's short session by posing a question which I would want you to juxtapose with your current experience and your life. The question is, were you prepared? Were you trained, prepared, and equipped with the necessary tools for a successful, loving relationship with a significant other? Let me ask that question again. Were you equipped? Were you prepared with the necessary skills, attitude, tools, knowledge, information required for a successful, loving relationship? However you design or define that relationship to be. Now, before you answer the question, and I don't expect you in the few seconds that I have just put the question to you, I don't expect you to come up with a very swift answer, because that question in itself requires some level of reflection. People who answer that question immediately, without thought, without taking the time to search through their reasoning faculty, their memory, often make a mistake in answering too quickly. Let me use a different analogy. Perhaps this might help in finding the answers to the original question. If you drive, and I remember myself, the first time I ever drove a car, I had observed over many years as a child my father and my mother driving, and eventually I came across friends who drove at a very young age. I made the mistake of thinking that just because I could observe, study through other people's experiences, that I could replicate their driving knowledge, their driving experience, and therefore outcomes. Now, I remember specifically in one particular occasion, I asked my mother if I could drive her to church. On this particular day, we all got into the car, and I hate to say that I had an accident on the way to church. I remember this vividly because it was very embarrassing. I had persuaded my mother into believing that I had learned how to drive very well in the prior months, and my experience was much better than what she thought it was. Now, what was embarrassing the most was, I remember getting into the accident, exchanging insurance or vehicle details, or rather my mother doing this. She got into the driver's seat. I got back into the passenger seat with my siblings, and we drove to church. When we got to church, my mother had to park the car facing or next to the fence, but facing in the direction opposite what people could see, so that most people couldn't see the car and therefore ask questions. You see, that was one of the most important learning experiences for me. From my early childhood, I found that I was drawn to information and knowledge and the quest to study. The only problem we have as human beings, even in our relationships, is ignorance. But study is how we displace ignorance and gather information. There are three levels of how we go from the basic stage of learning to what I call the advanced stage of learning. There is information which you obtain through various sources. Not all information are created equal. Some are good, some are bad, and some are in between. Information, when studied, leads to knowledge. So you obtain knowledge through information by study. But just because you have knowledge, it doesn't mean that you know how to apply said knowledge. You need to comprehend that knowledge, which is what leads to understanding, which is why the early writers said, in all you're getting, get understanding, although wisdom is supreme. Knowledge, understanding, wisdom. Wisdom is the highest part of that process. But the early writers say, in all you're getting, get understanding, although wisdom is supreme. To have understanding, you need comprehension. Now, if you have understanding, that should push you towards taking action. And the feedback from the action is what you use to modify and improve on your results by taking action and correcting your performance, what I call continuous and never-ending growth and improvement. You see, that model works across all facets of life, which is why in relationships, despite what we think, what we need to be successful is wisdom. But if we cannot get wisdom, we need understanding. When I had the accident the first time, it dawned on me that although I had the information and although I had the knowledge, I lacked the understanding, and most importantly, I lacked the practical application. I was trying to do something I had never done on a busy road with various traffic and people driving at different speeds, and I hadn't developed my ability to react. My braking time and my stopping time were conflated. Now, I use this example as a thought starter to go back to the question that I asked originally. To be a good driver, you have to go through several steps. You have to be taught what we call practically, which is the ultimate test, but you also have to be taught in what I call the basics, which is the theory test. You take a theory test, you get a provisional license. That doesn't mean you're able to drive. It means you may be able to drive with supervision, with someone more experienced and under certain conditions. Once you've studied enough, you have to take a practical test. And when you take the test, you're judged based on a combination of what you've learned from the theoretical experience and the practical lessons. And if you're successful, you get a full license. When you receive the full license, you're still what I call a beginner driver. So for some people, they still put the number or the sign on the cars to alert the other drivers that whilst they might be qualified as a fully licensed road user, that they are still beginners, and therefore other road users should be careful. If you keep driving in different conditions over different periods, over a different number of months or years or days, you develop experience. You get to a point where driving becomes less of a conscious activity and more of a subconscious activity. On the motorway, you're driving with your subconscious mind. As you approach a location where there could be traffic, or as you approach a vehicle which is either too large compared to yours, and you are either overtaken or being overtaken by another car, you switch from your subconscious to your conscious. You take control and you make sure that you are completely alert. But basically your subconscious mind is what helps you drive, which is why we can We can speak to other people on the phone whilst eating an apple, whilst driving at 60, 70 miles an hour. You could only do all of those things via your subconscious training. We don't think about eating an apple, and we don't think, generally speaking, when we're speaking on the phone with other people. And we don't think always whilst we're driving. There is a level of subconscious activity that takes place in each of those activities. Now, if we have prepared properly to learn how to drive, it becomes easy to navigate life and drive in different roads, weather conditions, time zones. It's easy for you to drive safely and therefore to ensure that you are safe and the people in the car are safe. Now, relationships are not too dissimilar. I like to use cars as a useful analogy for relationships, but they're not the same, but they serve in creating a template through which we can start to think about our relationships and the outcomes we wish to experience from our relationships. I go back to the question I asked. Were you prepared for relationships? And this question comes in two parts. Were you taught explicitly or implicitly? Second part. Did you observe and therefore model what you observed explicitly or implicitly? Now, for most of us, the answer to that question will be no. And it shouldn't be something to be ashamed of. It shouldn't. Very few people have the rare opportunity to be taught, trained, and equipped with what you will require for a successful relationship over your lifetime, over your life cycle. Very few parents provide that training, not because the parents don't have the information, but in many ways because things happen, life happens, and some parents are burdened with providing food, shelter, clothing, and sustenance. And they don't have the time to sit you down and equip you with all you may need for a successful relationship. Now, in today's session, I will not be going into the detail. I thought perhaps it would be a useful way to start the conversation, to allow you to think about the question. Now, in the sessions that follow, I am going to break that question down into several useful sub-questions, and I will endeavor to provide answers. Now, you may not have been taught, but you better learn what you need to have a successful relationship. Let me close today's session by saying the following statements. Number one, let's assume you are 18. You've now become an adult. From 0 years to 18 years, someone else is responsible for your results, generally speaking, because they were responsible for implanting or for modeling everything that is part of your habits, paradigms, thought process, beliefs, and value system. You had nothing to do with that. Like a sponge, you've simply absorbed everything around you up until what we call the age of reason, the age where you can distinguish between good and evil, and you can avoid certain things. But prior to your age of reason, most people, we are simply a product of the genetic makeup of our parents. We're simply a product of our environment. Therefore, the knowledge we have, the beliefs we have, the information we have, our mannerisms, our attitude have been given to us. It doesn't matter whether those or the information was sound or wrong. The information is within you. From 18, or said in a more eloquent way, from today, whatever occurs in your life going forward is your choice. You don't have to live in the same manner, in the same way as you did in the past. You can choose. Every day you can start anew and simply say, other people were responsible for my results up until today. And from today onwards, I will decide, I will choose, I will selectively discriminate on the information I allow into my system, into my influence, and therefore I can control, to a degree, some of my outcomes. Now, that decision applies in relationships as well. If you were not trained, and by training I mean if you were not given the right information, if it wasn't explained to you, if you didn't have the curiosity to ask questions, and therefore didn't comprehend, therefore lacking understanding, there's a possibility that some of the actions that you have taken, like I did for so many years, were flawed, which is why we learn in two ways. We learn from our mistakes, or we can learn from our mentors, people who influenced us, a positive role model that selectively chose the ingredients, the thoughts, the feelings, the actions that will be placed in your subconscious mind. And therefore, under that person's or those people's guidance, you find actually you have the right foundations. The foundations upon which you build a relationship is on solid ground. Now, if you were not trained explicitly or implicitly by modeling, in other words, if you did not have the right role models, there's a very high chance that your behavior and what you bring to your relationships is simply a regurgitation of all of the things that you learned explicitly and the things that were given to you and the things that were not given to you, and therefore the results that you may be having. As I found, the results that I was having for a period of time in my life were not the results that I wanted, but they were the results that were byproducts of the traits, the value systems, the knowledge, the information in my subconscious mind. There were habits, there were paradigms, they were fixed, and it didn't matter what I wished for on the outside. All that mattered was what was on the inside. Thoughts control our feelings control, in many ways, our attitude, our actions. Our actions over time become part of our character, our behavior, and therefore our destiny. So, in conclusion, I would like you to consider the question I started with again. Go back into your life and think about your past relationships and think about your present relationship, if you have one, and answer the question: was I equipped? Was I trained? Was I given or provided the necessary tools, information, knowledge, know-how for a successful relationship over the life cycle of my life? Now, in the next session, I will start to pick apart some of these issues. Obviously, we always begin casually dating people. From 18, we start very young. And over time, that relationship starts to change. We move from the dating marketplace, or from dating, to wanting something more meaningful, something more substantial. And therefore, we might want a long-term partner. There is short-term dating, there is medium-term dating, there is long-term dating. The skills you need in order to have a successful relationship in each life cycle stage varies. Now, there are some core ingredients or core sets of, you might say, information and knowledge that you need, but the application has to evolve. And even when you get into the stage of a long-term relationship, what you find is, as you age with a loved one, they also age. Their needs will change, Their hopes and dreams will change. Their expectations should change. And your ability to adapt and alter your expectations and alter your gifts of service should mirror the life cycle stage that both of you find yourself in. Now, I hope that this introduction section has been useful.